By 8:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood on the USS Augusta's bridge, watching his entire invasion effort bleed out. Through salted, misty binoculars, the view of Omaha Beach was devastating, a ruin. Bodies drifted in the foaming surf. Landing vessels were burning wreckage near the tide line. Soldiers who somehow reached the sand were motionless, trapped behind metal obstacles, utterly pinned by a relentless torrent of German machine gun fire that hadn't paused since sunrise. Bradley had promised these very men that a massive naval bombardment would totally erase the German defenses before their boots even touched the French coastline. He had guaranteed they would meet only demoralized, low-quality enemy troops. Now, more than 2,000 were dead or dying. The general, commanding all American ground forces, was quietly weighing a catastrophic, unthinkable order: evacuation. He considered pulling the battered survivors off Omaha, diverting the next assault waves toward Utah Beach or into the British landing zone at Gold. This would mean acknowledging that the primary American assault had failed entirely, even before it truly got underway. What Bradley was entirely unaware of, and couldn't possibly know from his observation point 8 miles offshore, was that in the very center of that lethal chaos, a 51-year-old general, struggling with a heart condition and relying on a walking cane, was about to fundamentally change the situation. The British military establishment had deep reservations about the Americans from the very start. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff and operational head of the British Army, kept a detailed journal throughout the conflict. In its pages, he documented his private feelings about strategic planning, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and the American allies whose entry into the war had certainly prevented Britain's utter collapse. Brooke certainly respected American industrial might. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh were producing overwhelming numbers of tanks, planes, and ammunition at a rate the German war machine could never equal. Yet American soldiers were a different matter altogether. In Brooke's seasoned opinion, they severely lacked the hardened combat experience that 2 years of brutal fighting in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy had given the British troops. He firmly believed American senior commanders failed to fully grasp the professional quality and sheer brutality of the German war machine they were about to confront. This critical skepticism was not born of personal dislike. It stemmed from deeply ingrained institutional memory. The British had watched the vast French army collapse in a mere 6 weeks during 1940. They had rescued their own forces from the shores of Dunkirk, with the enemy pressing at their backs. They had lost Singapore and countless other key positions to enemies who consistently maneuvered faster and fought with a greater intensity than anticipated. Extreme caution had become the core of British military doctrine. The Americans, with their characteristic optimism, their abundance of resources, and their soldiers who had never once faced a veteran Wehrmacht division in a major open battle, seemed dangerously unprepared and naive. Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself shared these profound concerns. As late as February 1944, just 4 short months before the colossal invasion, he was still actively questioning the entire operational strategy. "Why are we attempting this?" he would demand in high-level meetings. He proposed multiple alternatives: a push into Norway, the Mediterranean, the Balkans, literally anywhere other than a head-on assault on the most fortified coastal defense system anywhere on Earth. The British strategic preference was for a prolonged campaign of attrition, grinding the Germans down through massive aerial bombing, through peripheral draining campaigns, and critically, through letting the Soviet Union exhaust the Wehrmacht's strength on the brutal Eastern Front. Only when German strength was sufficiently weakened and bled out should the Allies ever risk a cross-channel invasion. The Americans vehemently disagreed. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, demanded a forceful concentration of military power at what he deemed the decisive point. His strategy was to hit the enemy where the pain would be greatest. His objective was to end the war quickly and decisively, to stop the killing as soon as possible. This deep, fundamental strategic disagreement shaped every single facet of the invasion's planning. The British demanded more preparatory time, greater planning, and a higher degree of certainty. The Americans simply demanded immediate action. Ultimately, it was Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin who broke this stubborn deadlock. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, the Soviet leader joined with President Franklin Roosevelt in aggressively demanding a firm, fixed date for the invasion. Churchill, finding himself completely outnumbered, reluctantly agreed to May 1944, a date which was later delayed till June due to unforeseen shortages of necessary landing craft. But even as the crucial date rapidly approached, the core British doubts persisted. Would American generals be able to make swift, sound decisions when initial plans utterly collapsed? Would these young men from farms in Iowa and Texas and the cities of California possess the discipline and the raw courage needed to seize a fortified beach against veteran German defenders? June 6th, the day itself, would soon provide the inescapable answer. The overall relationship between the British and American forces in the months leading up to D-Day was complicated by both a vast difference in history and stark cultural divides. British officers had already been fighting continuously since 1939. They had endured the fall of France, the nightly terror of the Blitz, the devastating defeats in Greece and Crete, and the long, grinding, bitter campaign across North Africa. They had lost dear friends, trusted colleagues, and entire military divisions. They had learned the hardest possible lessons about professional German soldiery and devastating German firepower. American officers, by contrast, had only entered the war in December 1941. Most had never experienced a single shot fired in anger until the North Africa campaign in late 1942. Even the American veterans of Sicily and the Italy campaigns were still widely considered relatively inexperienced by the strict British standards. This significant experience gap inevitably created intense friction. British officers sometimes treated their younger American counterparts as students desperately in need of constant instruction. American officers, in turn, often deeply resented this subtle British condescension. The essential alliance was undoubtedly real, but the inner tensions were just as palpable. General Montgomery himself perfectly embodied these contradictions. He genuinely respected Dwight Eisenhower, the American general who was appointed as the supreme commander of all Allied expeditionary forces. He also sincerely believed that his own grasp of ground warfare strategy was fundamentally superior to anything Eisenhower would ever possess. In Montgomery's specific estimation, the Americans held immense potential, but they absolutely required British guidance and careful mentorship to realize it. Bradley, who commanded American ground forces beneath Montgomery during the invasion, certainly felt this strain. Montgomery left me with the clear impression that I was merely a poor, distant country cousin whom he felt obliged to tolerate, Bradley later wrote in fresh wording. The comment perfectly captured a real and persistent dynamic, one that would continue to shape their interactions throughout the entire Normandy campaign. Yet there existed another side to the overall British attitude. Montgomery had personally toured numerous American training camps across England in the spring of 1944. He spoke directly to the American soldiers, completely unscripted, connecting with them in an unexpectedly personal way that genuinely surprised his own staff. The troops reacted with overwhelming warmth. They cheered his arrival and cheered when he departed. Whatever Montgomery privately thought of the American generals, he certainly recognized a vital, powerful quality in the American soldiers themselves. These were young men who were intensely willing to fight. They had journeyed across an entire ocean to liberate a continent they had never actually laid eyes on. They believed in their ultimate cause with an intense fervor that occasionally made the more cynical British officers uncomfortable. The critical question, however, remained. Would mere belief be enough once the bullets began to fly in earnest? The strategic planning for the assault on Omaha Beach rested on many flawed assumptions, all of which proved spectacularly incorrect. Army intelligence incorrectly believed the beach was defended by only a single regiment of the German 716th Static Infantry Division. These were supposedly low-quality, second-rate troops, older men and foreign conscripts deemed entirely unfit for the ferocious Eastern Front. The Allied planners confidently anticipated only light, scattered resistance. What they critically did not know was that the elite German 352nd Infantry Division had been moved into the area back in March. This was a completely different kind of military unit. Younger, highly motivated soldiers with veteran officers and non-commissioned officers transferred directly from the Eastern Front, featuring superior equipment and significantly higher morale. The invasion scheme also dangerously assumed that both air and naval bombardment would utterly obliterate the German defenses well before the first soldier set foot on the sand. Heavy bombers were meant to crater the beach, creating essential cover for the advancing troops. Naval cannons were scheduled to demolish the concrete fortifications overlooking the high tide line. Neither of these events actually transpired. Low cloud cover on the morning of June 6th tragically forced the heavy bomber formations to delay their bomb release, desperately trying to avoid striking the Allied ships below. In those brief, crucial seconds of delay, the aircraft flew far enough inland that their payload fell not onto the beach itself, but harmlessly into the empty farm fields well beyond. The prepared German positions remained completely untouched. The naval bombardment itself lasted a mere 40 minutes. Rear Admiral John Hall had vigorously argued for sustained, hours-long fire, but his superiors overruled his professional judgment. "It is a criminal act to send me into the largest amphibious attack in human history with such pathetically inadequate naval gunfire support," Hall stated. He was tragically proven correct. And then came the critical issue of the tanks. The official plan had designated 32 amphibious Sherman tanks to land simultaneously with the first wave at Omaha, providing essential mobile artillery support as the infantry moved forward. These were the specialized DD tanks, modified with canvas flotation screens that allowed them to swim ashore from their landing craft. But the unpredictable English Channel on June 6th was utterly uncooperative. 5-foot swells and powerful currents tore at the fragile screens. In Omaha's eastern sector, 29 tanks were launched into the sea. 27 sank immediately, well before reaching the beach, their crews drowning, trapped inside the hulls. In the western sector, the tank commander made a brilliant decision, wisely refusing to launch, instead ordering his Shermans to be delivered directly onto the dry sand. The brave men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions therefore arrived at Omaha without necessary armor support, completely lacking effective air cover, and facing an enemy force significantly stronger than anyone had led them to expect. The sheer killing began instantly. Countless soldiers died before they could even fully exit their landing craft. German machine gunners had carefully registered their weapons precisely on the waterline. They knew exactly where the steel ramps would drop. The moment those doors swung open, a deadly spray of bullets poured in. Men who miraculously survived the ramps then jumped into deep water, often over their heads, weighed down with heavy combat gear. Some tragically drowned within a few feet of the shore. Others struggled successfully through the violent surf, only to find absolutely no cover available on the sand. The bomb craters that were supposed to shelter them simply did not exist. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, a component of the 29th Division, landed directly in front of a major German strongpoint. Within a horrific 10 minutes, the company had suffered a staggering 96% casualty rate. Out of over 200 men, fewer than 20 reached the protection of the seawall. The survivors who successfully made it to the beach found themselves completely trapped. Behind them, the relentlessly rising tide. Ahead, a gradual incline of sand leading up to a concrete seawall, then a strip of marsh grass, and finally, steep bluffs crowned with formidable German bunkers. Every single inch of that terrain was covered by a lethal web of interlocking fields of fire. Soldiers huddled desperately behind the steel obstacles originally designed to shred the bottoms of landing craft. They pressed their bodies deep into the sand and waited, praying for a miracle. Some were in a state of shock, completely unable to move or obey orders. Others were severely wounded, crying out for medics who were utterly unable to reach them. The official timeline demanded that American troops be 1 mile inland by 8:30 in the morning. 6 excruciating hours after the assault began, they held only 10 harrowing yards of the beach. Brigadier General Norman Cota landed at Omaha Beach at 7:30 a.m., exactly 1 hour after the disastrous first wave. At 51 years old, he was the assistant division commander of the 29th Infantry Division, making him one of the highest-ranking officers to voluntarily step ashore that brutal day. His landing craft immediately took heavy machine gun fire on the approach. 3 brave soldiers were instantly killed while exiting the boat. Cota had always strenuously opposed the daylight landing. In the planning conferences, he had argued firmly for a pre-dawn assault, believing tactical surprise offered the absolute best chance for success. His superiors dismissed his concerns. The combined naval and air bombardment would neutralize the German defenses, they assured him. The defenders would be outnumbered, completely inexperienced, and totally demoralized. Cota's objection was not merely pessimism. He was a thorough student of amphibious operations. Prior to D-Day, he served as the American consultant to the Combined Operations Division in the European theater. He had personally helped train troops for specialized beach landings. He fully understood all the potential failure points. At a major conference on landing assaults in 1943, Cota made his professional case directly. Tactical surprise is one of the most powerful factors determining success, he explained to the assembled officers. I strongly favor the night landing. I sincerely doubt the daylight assault can possibly succeed. Other senior commanders shared his deep concerns. Major General Leonard Jarrow, commander of V Corps, pushed for the same approach. So did Admiral John Hall, who commanded the naval forces tasked with delivering the troops to Omaha. All 3 experienced men were completely overruled by the higher command. The decision-makers firmly believed that massive naval and air bombardment would fully compensate for the complete lack of surprise. They were horribly mistaken, and Cota knew they would be. But once the final decision was made, he worked diligently to prepare his men for the absolute worst-case scenario. On the afternoon just before the invasion, he had gathered his staff and provided them with a sobering, different kind of briefing. This scenario is entirely unlike any of the training exercises you have conducted. The landing vessels will not adhere to the schedule, and people will be put down in the completely wrong locations. Some will not be landed at all. We must improvise, stay focused, and do not lose your nerve. Now, standing on a beachfront littered with the dying and the dead, Cota began to improvise. He walked completely upright while every other man crawled or hugged the earth. Cota strode across the beach as if German bullets simply could not harm him. He moved relentlessly from one huddled group to the next, aggressively rallying shell-shocked soldiers, literally kicking men into action, pointing them toward the daunting bluffs and screaming precise orders. At one point, he came upon soldiers from the 5th Ranger Battalion who were pinned down tightly near the seawall. He asked the commander for their unit identification. "5th Rangers," someone quickly yelled back. Cota's immediate sharp reply became an instant legend. "Well, damn it all then, the Rangers lead the way." That powerful phrase would later become the official motto for the entire United States Army Rangers. But on June 6, 1944, it was simply a general demanding that his men cease dying miserably on the sand and start killing Germans instead. The Rangers at Omaha that day were elite troops, dedicated volunteers who had undergone notoriously brutal training for special operations. Their original objective was the assault on Point du Hoc, a sheer cliff overlooking the beach where massive German artillery supposedly threatened the entire invasion fleet. Some Rangers had successfully scaled those cliffs in one of the most famous, daring actions of the day. But other Ranger components, including elements of the 2nd and 5th Battalions, had been redirected to Omaha when communications broke down completely. They landed expecting to link up with their comrades at Point du Hoc, but instead found themselves in the exact same killing zone as the regular infantry. The Rangers were certainly better trained than most of the troops on the beach. They were in superior physical shape. They had rehearsed assaulting fortified positions many times. But none of that specialized training mattered when one was pinned down tight behind a low seawall with continuous machine gun fire whizzing mere inches above one's head. The Rangers followed him, not because of his rank, but because of his decisive actions. A nearby soldier possessed a Bangalore torpedo, a long tube packed with explosives used to blast gaps through wire obstacles. Cota ordered him to use it immediately on the barbed wire blocking the path up the bluff. The resulting explosions successfully opened a breach. The very first man who charged through was instantly shot dead by a German sniper. The soldiers clustered behind him froze in fear. Cota did not freeze. He walked straight into the smoking breach himself, stepped through the gap in the wire, and started climbing upward. When he finally looked back, a few men were beginning to follow him. Not many at first, but then more. Within just a few hours, small, desperate groups of soldiers were successfully pushing inland at multiple points along the terrifying length of Omaha Beach. They were no longer following the complex invasion plan because the invasion plan was completely obsolete. They were following sergeants and lieutenants and private soldiers who had simply decided that moving forward was preferable to dying in place. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment famously summarized the dire situation with brutal, clear honesty. "There are only two categories of people remaining on this beach," he informed his men. "Those who are already dead and those who are about to die. Now, let's get the hell off of here." By late afternoon, the beach was no longer a total killing field. It was now a tenuous, fragile beachhead bought at a truly terrible price, but undeniably established. The Navy had saved them. When Bradley was seriously contemplating evacuation, Rear Admiral Alan Kirk asked if the Navy could possibly intervene to break the agonizing stalemate. The answer was a resounding yes. Destroyers that had withdrawn after the initial brief bombardment returned to the beachfront, maneuvering to within a perilous 800 yards of the shore. This was dangerously close. The water was shallow, and the destroyers risked running aground. They did not care about the risk. Rear Admiral Carlton Bryant radioed an impassioned, general message from the battleship USS Texas. "Get on them, men! Get on them! They're raising hell with the poor men on the beach, and we cannot tolerate any more of that. We must stop it now." The destroyer captains responded with every weapon they had. They poured a devastating, non-stop fire into the German positions on the bluffs, specifically targeting the concrete bunkers and machine gun nests that the earlier aerial bombardment had completely missed. Some ships fired until their heavy guns were severely overheated. Others completely expended their entire ammunition supply. Colonel Stanhope Mason, Chief of Staff of the 1st Infantry Division, later directly credited the Navy with making survival possible. "I am absolutely convinced that our supporting naval fire got us in," he asserted. "Without that massive gunfire, we definitely could not have crossed the beaches." But gunfire alone did not clear Omaha. Men did. Men like Cota and Taylor, and hundreds of entirely unnamed sergeants and privates who simply chose to keep moving. At Utah Beach, located 15 miles to the west, a dramatically different style of American leadership was vividly on display. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was 56 years old, making him the single oldest man to storm the beaches on D-Day. And he was the only general officer to land with the absolute first wave of troops. He walked with a noticeable cane because of severe arthritis resulting from wounds sustained in the First World War. He also had a significant heart condition that he had carefully concealed from the Army doctors, knowing they would never medically clear him for active combat. Roosevelt had formally requested permission to land with the assault troops 3 separate times. Twice his commanding officer flatly refused him. The third request, submitted in detailed writing, was finally approved. Major General Raymond Barton, commander of the 4th Infantry Division, signed the paperwork, fully expecting that Roosevelt would certainly die on the beach. Roosevelt's thoughtful written request clearly explained his rationale. The sheer force and skill with which the initial elements strike the beach and proceed inland might ultimately determine the entire operation's success. I believe I can contribute materially by personally going in with the assault companies. Furthermore, I know both the officers and the men of these advance units personally and believe that my presence will steady them. This was not empty bravado. Roosevelt genuinely understood that soldiers perform better when they know their commander is actively sharing their exact danger. He had first learned that vital lesson in the First World War when he led his troops through some of the bloodiest fighting on the entire Western Front. He had been gassed and shot. He had won multiple decorations for valor. He knew exactly what active combat demanded. Between the wars, Roosevelt pursued a political career. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Harding. He was Governor of Puerto Rico and later served as Governor General of the Philippines. He even ran for Governor of New York and lost. When the Second World War erupted, he was already in his 50s and suffering from health issues that would have easily excused him from all service. He refused to be excused. He returned to active duty and aggressively pushed for combat assignments despite his advanced age and physical ailments. He had action in North Africa and Sicily before being assigned to the 4th Division for the Normandy invasion. The 4th Division was a distinct type of unit compared to the 29th at Omaha. It was a regular Army division, staffed with professionals and intensively trained, but it too was facing its first major amphibious assault against prepared defenses. Roosevelt was convinced his personal presence would make a profound difference. He was entirely right. He did not die. He landed in the wrong place. Powerful currents pushed the first wave of landing craft almost 2,000 yards south of their pre-planned target. Roosevelt came ashore, took a quick look around, and made a brilliant, decisive call that would ultimately save countless lives. "We will start the war from right here," he calmly announced. Instead of attempting to move his troops towards the original, distant landing zone under fire, Roosevelt immediately ordered them to advance inland from their current, actual position. He personally scouted the area, walking through German fire to identify clear routes off the beach. He stood at the waterline as the subsequent waves arrived, directing each arriving unit to its new revised objective. His son, Captain Quentin Roosevelt II, landed that very morning on Omaha Beach. They remained the only father and son to both come ashore on D-Day. A single man with a cane, walking calmly through German artillery fire. Years later, General Omar Bradley was asked to name the single most heroic action he had personally witnessed in combat. He answered instantly, without hesitation, Ted Roosevelt on Utah Beach. Roosevelt received the prestigious Medal of Honor for his extraordinary actions on June 6th. He tragically died of a heart attack 5 short weeks later, still serving in Normandy, still among his men. He never learned of his supreme decoration.
Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded all Allied ground forces during the critical D-Day operation. He was undoubtedly the most celebrated British general of the entire war, the hero of El Alamein, the commander who had finally routed Erwin Rommel in North Africa. Montgomery had overseen the crucial final planning phases for Operation Overlord. He was the one who expanded the initial invasion from 3 divisions to 5, arguing adamantly that the original scheme was far too limited. He had visited American units stationed in England during the months before the invasion, speaking directly to the troops, actively building their confidence. His popularity among the American soldiers was entirely genuine. Yet, Montgomery was watching June 6th with an exceptional level of attention. The British landing beaches, Gold and Sword, were his primary operational concern. The Canadian landing at Juneau also fell squarely under his command. The American performance at Omaha and Utah was profoundly important to him, because any failure there would immediately expose his own flank to counterattack. The initial reports from Omaha during the morning were seriously alarming. Montgomery knew that Bradley was contemplating an evacuation. He also fully understood that pulling American troops off one beach and trying to redirect them to another would create a logistical nightmare that could doom the entire complex invasion. Montgomery had a contingency plan. If Omaha completely failed, he considered the option of funneling the American V Corps through Gold Beach, integrating them through the British sector to keep the advance moving. But this option absolutely relied on confirmed British success, and on the British beaches, success was not yet totally secured. Gold Beach was assigned to the veteran British 50th Division, the Northumbrians. These were seasoned veterans of North Africa and Sicily, experienced soldiers who intimately knew the sound and fury of German fire. Their landing went significantly better than Omaha's, but it was not without heavy cost. German artillery and mortar fire severely struck the assault waves. Several coastal villages had to be cleared house by house. At Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division landed with the primary objective of immediately capturing Caen, the largest city in the invasion zone. Caen was optimistically scheduled to fall on D-Day. It would not actually fall for another entire month. German armor, specifically the 21st Panzer Division, launched a massive counterattack in the late afternoon that seriously threatened to split the British beachhead in 2. Only the timely arrival of glider-borne reinforcements turned the tide. Montgomery's original rapid plan to take Caen had completely failed. His ambitious timeline was already shattered by nightfall on June 6th. But critically, the beachhead held, and on Omaha, against every logical expectation, the Americans had held their line as well. The vast difference between British and American performance on D-Day was not a simple tale of one nation's success and another's failure. Both armies encountered fierce German resistance. Both armies sustained devastating casualties. Both armies achieved their absolute minimum objectives while falling short of their more ambitious goals. But the nature of the fighting differed dramatically. British operations were highly methodical. The 50th Division at Gold Beach advanced strictly according to established doctrine, using combined arms tactics perfected over years of combat experience. Infantry worked closely with tanks, artillery consistently supported infantry, air cover successfully suppressed German positions. The overall advance was steady, reliable, if not exactly spectacular. American operations were characterized by utter chaos. At Omaha, doctrine completely disintegrated within minutes of the initial landing. Units designated for specific assault objectives never reached their planned beaches. Officers slated to lead companies perished in the frigid surf. The entire chain of command violently fragmented. What rapidly replaced the doctrine was something far more essential and primal: individual initiative, immediate small group leadership, and aggressive willingness to improvise that many British observers found simultaneously alarming and deeply impressive. British Army training heavily emphasized strict adherence to orders. The plan was fixed, you executed the plan exactly. American training, particularly among the civilian soldiers of the National Guard and the draftee divisions, was far less rigid. When the plan failed, Americans were significantly more likely to quickly devise a new one right on the spot. This spontaneity was not always an advantage. Sometimes it led to utter confusion and a waste of effort. But on Omaha Beach, where the original plan was completely invalid from the start, it proved absolutely essential to survival. The British command watched the events unfold at Omaha Beach with a complex mixture of professional horror and burgeoning respect. The 29th Infantry Division that landed at Omaha was a National Guard unit composed of men from the state militias of Maryland and Virginia. Many of its soldiers had never experienced combat. By strict British metrics, they were green troops, precisely the kind of inexperienced Americans that Brooke and others had constantly worried about. The division carried a potent history. Its nickname was the Blue and Gray, reflecting its origins in states that had fought on opposite sides during the American Civil War. Men from Baltimore served alongside men from Richmond. The division's patch, a blue and gray design, symbolized that former enemies could become unified comrades. These were not career professional soldiers in the classic European sense. They were clerks, farmers, and factory workers who had joined the National Guard for extra income, or family tradition, or simple pure patriotism. They had trained together intensely for years, first as weekend warriors, then as full-time soldiers preparing for a major war they knew was coming. Their training was extensive but utterly untested in real combat. They had practiced amphibious landings at Slapton Sands in England, a location chosen because it perfectly resembled Omaha. They had rehearsed the assault plan countless times. They knew their objectives, their routes, their timing. None of this rigid preparation could prepare them for the sheer reality they faced on June 6th. The 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, was different. These were true veterans of North Africa and Sicily. They had fought German forces before. They knew the sound of incoming fire. They knew the devastating feeling of watching friends die. The 1st Division landed directly alongside the 29th at Omaha. The planning assumed their combat experience would stiffen the National Guardsmen, that veteran leadership would compensate for the green troops. In reality, veterans died just as quickly as newcomers. The German machine gunners certainly didn't check military service records before pulling their triggers. Yet, these green troops had collectively achieved something extraordinary. Under a volume of fire that would have completely shattered veteran units, with their essential armor lying at the bottom of the English Channel, with their officers dead and their plans utterly shredded, they had attacked. Not as a coordinated force executing a brilliant strategy, but as numerous small groups of desperate, courageous men who absolutely refused to simply die lying down. What most deeply impressed the British observers was the sheer, raw stubbornness of the American assault, a fundamental refusal to accept defeat, even when retreat seemed the only logical outcome. An almost defiant determination to maintain the fight when any rational army would have immediately fallen back. It was far from elegant, it did not adhere to military manuals, but it undeniably worked. Montgomery himself personally pinned the British Distinguished Service Order onto General Cota after the invasion's success. The DSO was one of Britain's highest military honors for gallantry, rarely ever conferred on foreign officers. The citation specifically recognized Cota's decisive leadership under intense fire, his critical role in rallying the dispersed troops, and his personal courage in leading men off the beach.
This was clearly not a perfunctory decoration. This was the British military establishment openly acknowledging that an American general had performed with absolutely exceptional valor, and that he had saved a critical moment in the invasion purely through sheer will. Other British awards soon followed. American officers and enlisted men received high decorations from the British government for their actions on D-Day. These awards were not mere paperwork exercises. They represented a genuine hard-won recognition from an ally that had begun the war highly skeptical of American capabilities, but emerged from June 6th with a profound new respect.
The profound lessons of D-Day irrevocably transformed the Allied alliance. Before June 6th, the British had often treated American forces as junior partners, desperately needing constant supervision. After June 6th, that ingrained attitude became much harder to maintain. The Americans had proven themselves completely in the most demanding test humanly imaginable. They had seized a highly fortified beach against experienced German defenders with entirely inadequate support and against impossible odds. They accomplished it through pure, raw courage and an almost unbelievable stubborn determination. This certainly did not mean that British criticisms completely vanished. Montgomery continued to openly clash with American generals throughout the entire campaign. Brooke continued to record his doubts in his diary. The fundamental differences in military philosophy persisted, but the nature of the criticism fundamentally changed. Before D-Day, British officers questioned whether Americans could fight effectively at all. After D-Day, they questioned American methods while openly acknowledging American results. The Americans might not choose to do things the traditional British way, but they undoubtedly accomplished their goals. This strategic shift had massive long-term implications. As the war progressed, American forces continuously grew in strength, while British forces gradually shrank. By 1945, the vast majority of Allied combat troops in Western Europe were American. The strategic balance of the entire alliance tilted decisively toward Washington. British generals had to adjust their thinking. They had no other option. The Americans were no longer students learning from their experienced teachers. They were absolute equals, sometimes even superiors, partners in a monumental enterprise that neither nation could have successfully completed alone. The mutual respect forged in fire on June 6th long outlasted the war itself. British and American officers who fought together in Normandy maintained strong relationships for decades after the war. They attended shared reunions. They wrote memoirs that respectfully acknowledged each other's vital contributions. They understood something that civilians often forgot. They had shared an unparalleled, binding experience, regardless of nationality. By August 1944, American forces had successfully broken out of Normandy in the stunning Operation Cobra. By September, they had liberated Paris. By the following spring, they were crossing the Rhine River directly into Germany proper. The British contributed immeasurably to this final victory. British intelligence had broken crucial German codes, providing vital information about enemy positions. British deception operations had skillfully convinced Hitler that the main invasion would strike at Calais, keeping significant German reserves well away from Normandy. British troops had drawn major German armor onto their sector, which critically enabled the American breakout. But the alliance that ultimately won the war was truly forged in the intense, deadly fire of June 6th. It was forged by courageous men like Cota and Roosevelt and the countless anonymous soldiers of the 1st and 29th Divisions who adamantly refused to accept that Omaha Beach could not be taken. The British watched these men fight and finally understood that the entire war had fundamentally changed. What the British said about American troops immediately after D-Day was highly varied. Some remained professionally critical. Some were completely converted to believers. Most fell somewhere in the middle, acknowledging the raw American courage while maintaining reservations about the unconventional American methods. But none of them could possibly deny the simple, powerful reality of what had happened at Omaha Beach. None could deny that the invasion had ultimately succeeded where it had come perilously close to failing. that the beachhead had held when pure logic suggested it should have collapsed, that Americans had achieved something that morning which commanded absolute respect. Montgomery personally awarded Cota the Distinguished Service Order. Brooke recorded the undeniable American success in his diary, right alongside his lingering criticisms. Churchill publicly praised the Americans in his speeches to Parliament and fully meant what he said. The essential alliance between Britain and America was never perfect. The two nations fought side by side, but not always with smooth cooperation. They disagreed on large-scale strategy, specific tactics, and national priorities. They competed for limited glory, critical resources, and final credit. But on June 6, 1944, they shared the same coastline. And on that coastline, under fire that brutally killed thousands, they proved that their powerful alliance possessed the necessary strength to win the entire war. The British had harbored their doubts about the Americans. Then they watched the Americans fight. And after that, whatever specific doubts remained were forever tempered by something infinitely stronger: respect. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was laid to rest in Normandy. His grave at the American Cemetery overlooks Omaha Beach, located near the spot where his son came ashore that same day he landed at Utah. They were among the very few father and son pairs to have bravely fought together on D-Day. Roosevelt's Medal of Honor citation uses formal military terminology. It speaks of his repeated, inspired leadership under fire, his daring personal reconnaissance through the enemy positions, and his complete disregard for his own personal safety. What those words can never truly capture is the powerful image of a 56-year-old general carrying a cane, walking calmly through German artillery fire. A general pointing directions to terrified young soldiers, resolutely telling them that starting the war from the wrong place did not mean they could not immediately win the battle. Omar Bradley, the general who had come so close to ordering the evacuation of Omaha Beach, later commanded the 12th Army Group, the single largest American field command in military history. By the war's conclusion, he was leading over 1.3 million soldiers. He eventually became a 5-star general of the Army, one of only 5 men to ever hold that specific rank. Bradley never forgot what he personally witnessed on June 6th. In his detailed memoirs and in his interviews, he returned consistently to the nightmare of Omaha Beach. "Every man who set foot on Omaha Beach that day was a true hero," he wrote. That statement was not false humility. Bradley had seen exactly what those men accomplished. He knew the immense cost. Montgomery returned to England after the war as a national hero. He served as chief of the Imperial General Staff and later as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. His long reputation fluctuated over the subsequent decades as historians debated his key decisions in Normandy. But his critical role in planning and brilliantly executing D-Day remained central to his legacy. The essential alliance between Britain and America that was so severely tested on June 6th continued long after the battlefield guns fell silent. NATO bound the two influential nations together throughout the difficult Cold War era and far beyond. The powerful cooperation forged in the summer of 1944 became the essential foundation of Western security for generations to come. If this powerful historical narrative moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share this story with someone who genuinely cares about history. And remember to subscribe to WWII Deep Insights to stay connected with these remarkable, untold stories from the Second World War. Every single one matters. Every single one truly deserves to be remembered. Leave a quick comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Our dedicated community spans the globe, from veterans to passionate history enthusiasts, and we are honored to have you join us here. Thank you so much for watching.